The rain fell like tiny knives on Zara's bare skin as she huddled beneath the broken concrete overhang, her forearms wrapped around her thin body, trying to keep what little warmth she had left from escaping into the cold night air. The city of New Korath stretched endlessly around her, its towering spires reaching toward the 3 moons that hung in the purple sky like watchful eyes. Zara pressed her back against the rough wall, feeling every ridge and crack through her torn clothing. She had been living on the streets for 6 months now, ever since her family had cast her out for being different. Her people, the Villani, valued strength and perfection above all else. But Zara had been born with a twisted leg and a mind that worked differently from others. In Villani society, such flaws were unforgivable. The sound of footsteps echoed through the narrow alley where she hid. Zara's heart raced as she pulled herself deeper into the shadows. The city guards often came through here at night, searching for homeless individuals to arrest or worse. She had learned to make herself invisible, to become one with the darkness that surrounded her. But these footsteps sounded different. They were heavier, more deliberate than the quick, nervous pace of the guards. As the figure emerged from the mist, Zara saw something that made her breath catch in her throat. It was a human. She had heard stories about humans, of course. Everyone in the galaxy had. They were the newcomers, the strange bipedal creatures who had somehow managed to spread across dozens of star systems in just a few short centuries. Most species viewed them with suspicion or outright fear. Humans were known for their unpredictability, their tendency to form emotional attachments to the most unlikely things, and their stubborn refusal to follow the established order of galactic society. The human stopped just a few meters away from her hiding spot. He was tall by human standards, with dark skin and kind eyes that seemed to see everything around him. His clothing was simple but well made, and he carried a large pack on his back that looked heavy with supplies. "I know you're there," he said softly, his voice carrying a strange accent that Zara had never heard before. "I'm not here to hurt you. My name is David Chen, and I'm just looking for a place to rest for the night." Zara remained perfectly still, hoping he would move on. But instead of leaving, David set down his pack and began pulling out items. A small heating unit, some dried food, and what looked like a water purifier. The smell of warm food began to fill the air, and Zara's empty stomach clenched with hunger. "You know," David continued, as if he were having a casual conversation with an old friend, "I've been walking through this city for 3 days now, and I haven't seen a single public shelter or aid station. That seems odd for such an advanced civilization." He activated the heating unit, and a gentle warmth began to spread through the alley. Zara found herself leaning slightly toward the heat without thinking about it. "On my home planet, we have places for people who need help," David said, opening a container of food. "We believe that everyone deserves a safe place to sleep and enough to eat. It's one of the things that makes us human, I suppose." Despite her fear, Zara found herself listening intently. She had never heard anyone speak like this before. In Villani society, weakness was despised, and those who couldn't take care of themselves were considered burdens to be discarded. David pulled out what looked like a small medical scanner and frowned as he looked at the readings. "The air quality here is terrible," he muttered. "High levels of toxic particles, probably from the industrial district. That can't be healthy for anyone, especially someone living outdoors." He glanced in her direction, and for a moment Zara was certain he could see her. But instead of calling out or demanding that she show herself, he simply continued preparing his meal. "I'm an engineer," he said conversationally. "I specialize in sustainable construction and environmental restoration. I came to this planet because I heard they were having problems with housing shortages and pollution. But so far the government officials I've met seem more interested in maintaining the status quo than actually solving problems." The smell of the warm food was becoming unbearable. Zara's last meal had been 2 days ago, scraps she had found behind a restaurant before the owner chased her away. Her body was weak from hunger and exposure, and she knew she couldn't survive much longer on the streets. As if reading her thoughts, David set a portion of food on a clean cloth and placed it on the ground between them. "I always make too much," he said. "It would be a shame to waste it." Zara stared at the food with desperate longing. It was clearly a trap, but she was beyond caring. If this human wanted to capture her or turn her into the authorities, at least she would have eaten one more meal. Slowly, painfully, she emerged from her hiding place. David looked up at her without surprise, as if he had known exactly where she was all along. His eyes took in her condition, the torn clothing, the visible ribs beneath her thin skin, the way she favored her good leg. But there was no disgust or pity in his expression, only a quiet sadness. "Hello," he said simply. "I'm glad you decided to join me." Zara limped forward and collapsed beside the cloth, grabbing the food with shaking hands. It was some kind of stew, rich with vegetables and protein she couldn't identify. It was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. David watched her eat without comment, occasionally adding more fuel to the heating unit to keep the warmth flowing. When she had finished every last bite, he handed her a cup of clean, purified water. "How long have you been on the streets?" he asked gently. Zara hesitated, then held up 6 fingers. David nodded as if this confirmed something he had already suspected. "And I'm guessing you're here because someone decided you didn't fit their definition of acceptable," he said. The accuracy of his guess surprised her. She nodded slowly, wondering how this stranger could understand her situation so completely. David was quiet for a long moment, studying the crumbling buildings around them. "You know," he said finally, "I've been thinking about setting up a permanent base here while I work on some projects. But I'll need help from someone who knows the city, someone who understands what it's like to survive in places others won't even look." He turned to look at her directly. "Would you be interested in a job?" Zara stared at David in complete disbelief. A job? No one had ever offered her work before. In Villani society, her physical differences marked her as unemployable, a burden that families were expected to bear until they could no longer tolerate the shame. "I don't understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It was the first time she had spoken aloud in weeks, and the words felt strange on her tongue. David smiled, a warm expression that reached his eyes. "It's simple. I need someone who knows this city inside and out, someone who can show me where the real problems are, not the sanitized version the officials want me to see. In return, you get regular meals, clean water, proper shelter, and fair pay for your work." "But Zara gestured helplessly at herself. "I'm broken, useless, that's why I'm here." The human's expression grew serious. "Who told you that?" "Everyone," Zara replied without hesitation. "My parents, my siblings, the teachers at school, the social workers. It's just the way things are." David was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, there was an edge of anger in his voice that wasn't directed at her. "On Earth we have a saying, the only disability in life is a bad attitude. It means that the biggest barriers people face usually come from others' prejudices, not from their actual abilities." He gestured to his pack, which was filled with complex-looking equipment. "I've worked with people of dozens of different species across the galaxy. Some of the most brilliant engineers I know have what others might call disabilities. A Krellian architect with no arms who designs with her mind alone. A Thaxian programmer who's completely deaf, but can see patterns in code that others miss. Different doesn't mean broken." Zara found herself wanting to believe him, but years of rejection had built walls around her heart. "What if I can't do whatever you need me to do?" "Then we'll figure out what you can do instead," David said simply. "That's how humans work. We adapt, we find solutions. We don't give up on people." He stood up and began packing his equipment. "But I understand if you need time to think about it. Trust doesn't come easy when you've been hurt. How about this? Let me show you something first." David pulled out a device that looked like a tablet computer and activated it. Holographic images appeared in the air between them, showing detailed architectural plans and environmental data. "This is what I do," he said. "I find places that others have given up on and figure out how to make them livable again." The images shifted to show before and after pictures of various construction projects. Toxic wastelands transformed into green spaces, crumbling slums rebuilt as thriving communities, polluted rivers cleaned and restored to health. "This is from my last project on Kepler Prime," David explained, showing images of a beautiful housing complex. The local government said the contaminated zone couldn't be fixed. They wanted to relocate everyone and turn it into an industrial dump. But the people living there couldn't afford to move, and they would have become homeless. Zara studied the images intently. The before pictures showed a place much like where she was living now. Broken buildings, polluted air, people huddled in shadows. The after pictures showed the same area transformed into something clean and beautiful, with gardens and play areas and people walking safely in the open. "It took 2 years," David continued. But we built new homes using sustainable materials, cleaned the soil and water, and created jobs for everyone who wanted to stay. The same people who had been written off as hopeless became the backbone of a thriving community. How? Zara asked, genuinely curious despite herself. By listening, David said. The locals knew things about their environment that no amount of official data could tell me. They knew which buildings were structurally sound, which water sources were safest where the real problems were, versus where the symptoms showed up. I provided the technical knowledge and resources, but they provided the wisdom that made it all work. He pointed to one of the holographic figures, a small alien child playing in what had once been a contaminated lot. That's Kip. When I first met him, he was sick from breathing toxic air every day. The doctors said his lung damage was permanent, but after we cleaned up the environment and got him proper medical care, he made a full recovery. He's training to be an environmental engineer now. Zara felt something stirring in her chest, a feeling she had almost forgotten existed. Hope. And you think I could help with something like this? I know you could, David said with certainty. You've survived 6 months on these streets. That tells me you're resourceful, observant, and tougher than most people realize. You know things about this city that I'll never learn from official reports or guided tours. He gestured to the buildings around them. Take this alley, for example. I've been here for 20 minutes, and I can already tell you several things about the local infrastructure just from what you've shown me by choosing this spot. The drainage system is failing. See how the water pools in that corner? The air filtration for this district is inadequate. You can taste the industrial chemicals. And the building materials are degrading faster than they should be, which suggests poor quality control in the construction. Zara looked around with new eyes. Seeing her environment the way David saw it, she had noticed all these things before, but had never thought of them as useful knowledge. But more importantly, David continued, you chose this particular spot out of dozens of possible hiding places. That tells me you know how to read the patterns of the city, where people go, where they don't go, how to stay safe and invisible. Those are exactly the kinds of insights I need. He stored the holographic device and shouldered his pack. I'm going to start scouting locations for a base of operations tomorrow. If you decide you want to help, meet me at the Central Plaza at sunrise. I'll be the human with the scanner equipment probably looking lost. David started to walk away, then paused and looked back. Oh, and Zara? Bring whatever belongings you have. If you're going to work for me, you're going to need a proper place to live. How do you know my name? She called after him, suddenly realizing she had never introduced herself. David smiled. I asked around. People notice more than they think they do, even when they pretend not to care. A shopkeeper 2 blocks over mentioned a quiet 4-armed girl who never causes trouble. A delivery driver said he sometimes left extra food scraps where he thought you might find them. You're not as invisible as you believe. As the human disappeared into the mist, Zara sat alone with her thoughts. For the first time in months, she wasn't thinking about where her next meal would come from, or where she would sleep safely. Instead, she was imagining what it might be like to have a purpose again, to be useful to someone who saw her as more than just a burden to be discarded. The heating unit David had left behind continued to radiate warmth, and Zara realized he had forgotten to take it with him. Or perhaps he had left it on purpose. Either way, she would sleep warm tonight for the first time in weeks. As she settled down to rest, Zara made a decision. Tomorrow she would be at the Central Plaza at sunrise. The first rays of dawn painted the Central Plaza in shades of gold and purple as Zara made her way through the early morning crowds. She had spent the night awake, partly from excitement and partly from fear that this was all some elaborate dream that would disappear with the sunrise. Her few possessions, a torn blanket, a cracked water container, and a small knife she used for protection, were wrapped in a bundle under her arm. Every step sent pain shooting through her twisted leg, but she ignored it. This was the first time in months that she had a destination, a purpose that went beyond simple survival. David was exactly where he had said he would be, standing near the fountain in the center of the plaza with a collection of scanning devices spread out around him. He looked completely out of place among the well-dressed Villani rushing to their morning appointments. But he didn't seem to care about the stares and whispered comments his presence generated. You came, he said when he spotted her, and the genuine pleasure in his voice made Zara's chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't name. I said I would, she replied, then hesitated. But I should warn you, I've never had a real job before. I don't know if I'll be any good at whatever you need me to do." David finished packing his equipment and stood up, brushing dust off his knees. "The best way to learn is by doing. Besides, I have a feeling you're going to surprise yourself." He led her away from the plaza and into one of the older districts of the city, where the buildings were shorter and more run down. As they walked, David explained what he was looking for. "I need a location that's large enough for a workshop and living quarters, but not so expensive that it'll drain my budget before I can get any real work done," he said. "It should be close enough to the problem areas that I can study them directly, but not so isolated that I can't get supplies and materials delivered." Zara listened carefully as they explored building after building. Most were either too small, too expensive, or too damaged to be practical. But as they walked, she began to notice David's methods. He didn't just look at the official listings and building specifications. He examined the foundations, tested the air quality, checked the water pressure, and asked detailed questions about the neighborhood that the rental agents couldn't answer. "This one's no good," Zara said, as they approached a large warehouse that looked promising from the outside. "The ground underneath is unstable. There was a chemical plant here 50 years ago, and sometimes the soil still shifts when it rains hard." David raised his eyebrows and pulled out his geological scanner. After a few minutes of testing, he nodded approvingly. "You're absolutely right. The soil composition shows signs of contamination and settling." "How did you know that?" "I used to sleep in the basement of the building next door," Zara explained. "During the rainy season, I could hear the ground creaking and moving, and sometimes there were bad smells that came up through the floor." "Excellent observation," David said, making notes on his tablet. "That kind of local knowledge could save me weeks of research and testing." They continued their search, and gradually Zara began to feel more confident about offering her opinions. When David considered a building near the industrial district, she pointed out that the air currents in that area carried toxic fumes that would make it impossible to work with sensitive equipment. When he looked at a space in the commercial quarter, she explained that the local security forces regularly swept through that area looking for undesirables to arrest. Finally, as the afternoon sun was beginning to sink toward the horizon, they found themselves in one of the oldest parts of the city. The buildings here were made of stone quarried from local mountains, and many of them had stood for centuries despite minimal maintenance. "What about this one?" David asked, stopping in front of a 3-story structure that had clearly seen better days. The windows were boarded up, the roof showed signs of weather damage, and weeds grew through cracks in the foundation. But the bones of the building looked solid. Zara studied it carefully, drawing on months of experience reading the subtle signs that marked safe and unsafe places. "The structure is good," she said finally. "Stone construction, deep foundations, thick walls. The damage is mostly cosmetic. And look." She pointed to small details that David had missed. "The water stains on the walls are old, which means the roof leaks have been there for a while but haven't gotten worse. That suggests the main support beams are still sound." David ran his hands along the stone walls, feeling for cracks or weak points. "You're right again. This could work beautifully. Good security, plenty of space, and the price should be reasonable since it needs so much cosmetic work." He contacted the rental agent, and after an hour of negotiations, they had a deal. The building was theirs for a year, with an option to purchase if David's projects proved successful. As they stood in the empty main room, David turned to Zara with a serious expression. "I want you to understand something. This isn't charity. I'm offering you this job because I genuinely need your help and I believe you can do it well. But it's also going to be hard work. We'll be putting in long hours, dealing with problems that don't have easy solutions, and probably facing opposition from people who don't want things to change." Zara looked around the empty space, trying to imagine it transformed into the kind of facility she had seen in David's holographic presentations. "What exactly will I be doing?" "Initially, you'll be my local guide and research assistant," David explained. "You'll help me understand the real situation in different parts of the city, identify the people and communities that need help the most, and figure out what kinds of solutions might actually work. Later, if you're interested, I can teach you about engineering and construction so you can take on bigger responsibilities." He walked over to a window and pried off one of the boards, letting sunlight stream into the dusty room. "But first, we need to make this place livable. I'll be designing the workshop areas and technical facilities. Would you be willing to take charge of the living quarters?" You know better than I do what people actually need to feel safe and comfortable. Zara felt overwhelmed by the scope of what David was proposing. She had gone from sleeping in alleys to being offered responsibility for part of a major construction project in the span of a single day. I don't know anything about construction, she admitted. Neither did I when I started, David replied. But I learned, and so can you. The most important thing isn't technical knowledge. It's understanding what people need and why they need it. You've got that understanding already. He pulled out his tablet and showed her the basic floor plans for the building. Think about it this way. If you could design the perfect living space for someone who has been homeless, what would it look like? What would make them feel safe? What would help them rebuild their life? As Zara studied the plans, ideas began to form in her mind. She thought about the months she had spent on the streets, remembering all the things she had missed most desperately. Privacy and security, certainly, but also simple things like a place to wash properly, space to store personal belongings, and windows that let in natural light. Could we have gardens? She asked suddenly. Small ones, maybe on the roof or in courtyards? Plants make everything feel more alive. David's face lit up. Absolutely. Green spaces are great for both physical and mental health. What else? For the next several hours, they walked through the building together, discussing possibilities and taking measurements. David explained basic principles of architecture and engineering, while Zara shared insights about what different kinds of people might need from their living spaces. As the day ended, David handed her a key to the building and a small device that looked like a communicator. This place is yours now too, he said. Pick any room you want for yourself and we'll fix it up first so you have a decent place to sleep while we work on the rest. The communicator will reach me anywhere in the city if you need anything or if there's an emergency. Zara stared at the key in her palm, unable to believe that she was holding the means to her own front door. For the first time since she had been cast out by her family, she had a home. Thank you, she whispered, the words completely inadequate for what she was feeling. David smiled. Thank you for giving me a chance to prove that humans aren't as strange as everyone thinks we are. 3 weeks had passed since Zara and David began working together, and the old stone building was already beginning to transform. The main floor had been cleared and converted into a workshop space filled with construction equipment, computers, and environmental monitoring devices. The second floor was taking shape as living quarters, with rooms designed according to the principles Zara had suggested. But it was the third floor that had become Zara's special project. David had given her complete control over designing a space that could serve as a temporary shelter for others who found themselves homeless and desperate. Working from her own experiences, she was creating something unlike anything else in the city. The problem with most shelters, Zara explained to David as they stood in the partially completed common room, is that they're designed by people who have never been homeless. They think all you need is a roof and 4 walls, but they don't understand what it feels like to have no control over your environment. She gestured to the various features she had incorporated into the design. Each sleeping area had privacy screens that residents could adjust themselves, along with secure storage for personal belongings and individual temperature controls. The common areas were arranged to provide both social space and quiet corners, where someone could be alone when needed. This is brilliant, David said, examining her detailed plans. You've thought of things I never would have considered. The way you've arranged the sight lines to eliminate blind corners where people might feel trapped. The multiple exit routes. The natural lighting that follows circadian rhythms. This isn't just shelter. It's therapeutic architecture. Zara blushed at the praise, still not entirely comfortable with being recognized for her abilities. Over the past weeks, David had been teaching her about construction techniques, architectural principles, and engineering systems. She was a quick learner, and her insights from living on the streets gave her a unique perspective on how buildings functioned in practice versus theory. Their work hadn't gone unnoticed by the local authorities. Just that morning, they had received a visit from Inspector Thale, a high-ranking official from the city planning department who made no effort to hide his disapproval of their project. This kind of facility will attract undesirable elements to the neighborhood. Thale had warned them. Property values will decline, crime rates will increase, and law-abiding citizens will be forced to relocate. I strongly advise you to reconsider your plans. David had listened politely to the inspector's concerns, then calmly presented data from his previous projects showing that, Well-designed social housing actually improved neighborhood stability and safety, but Zara could tell that Thalie remained unconvinced, and she suspected they would be hearing from him again soon. "We need to be careful," she told David as they continued working on the shelter floor. "Inspector Thale has a lot of influence in this city, and he doesn't like what we're doing. If he decides to shut us down, he'll find a way to do it." "Let me worry about the politics," David replied. "You focus on making this the best shelter possible. When people see what we're accomplishing here, the opposition will have a harder time justifying their objections." That afternoon, their first potential residents arrived. Word had spread through the homeless community that someone was building a new kind of shelter, one designed by someone who actually understood their needs. 3 individuals showed up at their door: an elderly Villani male who had lost his home due to medical debts, a young female of a species Zara didn't recognize who spoke very little of the local language, and a middle-aged Villani who had been injured in an industrial accident and could no longer work. Zara felt nervous as she showed them around the nearly completed shelter floor. These were her people, individuals who had been cast aside by society just as she had been. If the shelter didn't meet their needs, if she had misunderstood something fundamental about what homeless people required, the entire project could fail. But as the tour progressed, she saw their expressions change from skepticism to amazement. The elderly male, who introduced himself as Dren, kept running his hands along the smooth walls and sturdy furniture. "In the municipal shelters, everything is designed to be temporary and uncomfortable," he said. "They want to make sure you don't get too comfortable, that you keep trying to find somewhere else to go. But this feels like a place where someone could actually live with dignity." The young female, whose name was Kess, was most impressed by the privacy features. She had been assaulted in other shelters and had been sleeping rough because she was afraid to stay anywhere with other people. But the sight lines and security measures Zara had incorporated made her feel safe enough to consider staying indoors again. The injured worker, Jorik, was amazed by the accessibility features. Zara had designed everything to be usable by people with various physical limitations, incorporating ramps, adjustable surfaces, and equipment that could be operated with limited mobility. "I haven't seen this kind of thoughtful design anywhere else in the city," he said. "Most places seem to assume that if you're disabled and homeless, you're basically beyond help." As the 3 potential residents explored their new home, David pulled Zara aside. "You've created something special here," he said quietly. "This isn't just a shelter, it's a statement about how society should treat its most vulnerable members." Over the following days, word continued to spread, and more people arrived seeking shelter. Zara found herself in the unexpected role of intake coordinator, interviewing potential residents and helping them settle into their new accommodations. She discovered that she had a natural talent for understanding people's needs and helping them feel comfortable in their new environment. But she also began to notice patterns that concerned her. Many of the people seeking shelter had stories similar to her own. They had been cast out not because of any wrongdoing, but because they didn't fit society's narrow definition of acceptable. The elderly were discarded when they could no longer work. The disabled were abandoned when their care became inconvenient. The mentally ill were ignored when their conditions made others uncomfortable. "It's not just a housing problem," Zara told David one evening as they reviewed the day's intake interviews. "It's a fundamental issue with how this society treats anyone who isn't perfect according to their standards." David nodded grimly. "I've been seeing the same patterns in my environmental data. The pollution isn't evenly distributed. It's concentrated in areas where the poor and marginalized live. The infrastructure failures happen in neighborhoods that have been written off as unimportant. It's systemic discrimination disguised as urban planning." He pulled up a holographic map of the city, highlighting areas with the worst air quality, water contamination, and structural decay. The pattern was clear. The problems were clustered in districts where society's outcasts had been forced to live. "This is bigger than just providing shelter," David continued. "We need to address the underlying systems that create homelessness in the first place." Zara studied the map, thinking about all the people she had met over the past weeks. Each had a story of being failed by the systems that were supposed to protect them: healthcare, education, employment, family support. The shelter was helping individuals, but it wasn't fixing the larger problems. "What if we started documenting everything?" she suggested. "Every person's story, every case where the systems failed them, every example of how better support could have prevented them from becoming homeless. We could build a database that shows exactly how these problems develop and what interventions might work. David's eyes lit up. That's exactly the kind of data we need. If we can demonstrate the patterns clearly enough, it becomes much harder for officials like Inspector Thale to dismiss what we're doing as misguided charity. They began that very night, interviewing residents about their paths to homelessness and documenting the specific failures in social systems that had contributed to their situations. What they discovered was both heartbreaking and infuriating, in case after case. Relatively small interventions at earlier stages could have prevented people from losing their homes and becoming marginalized. As their database grew, a clearer picture emerged of how the city's social and economic systems were fundamentally broken. But more importantly, they also began to see potential solutions. Ways that targeted investments in support services, infrastructure improvements, and policy changes could address the root causes of homelessness rather than just managing its symptoms. "We're going to need allies," David said as they reviewed their growing collection of data. "This kind of systemic change can't happen with just the two of us." Zara nodded, thinking about all the people she had met who shared their concerns. Social workers frustrated by inadequate resources, medical professionals overwhelmed by preventable health crises, even some government employees who were tired of implementing policies they knew didn't work. "I think there are more people who want change than we realize," she said. "They just need someone to show them that change is actually possible." As they planned their next steps, neither of them noticed the figure watching their building from across the street, taking careful notes about who came and went. Inspector Thale was building his own case, and The confrontation came at dawn, just as Zara was preparing breakfast for the shelter residents. The sound of heavy footsteps echoing through the stone corridors made her heart race. She recognized that particular rhythm from her months on the streets. City enforcement officers moved with a distinctive cadence, designed to intimidate anyone who heard them coming. Inspector Thale entered the common room flanked by 6 armed guards, their official uniforms gleaming with authority badges and compliance scanners. Behind them came a small army of bureaucrats carrying official-looking documents and portable testing equipment. "By order of the Municipal Safety Commission," Thale announced in a loud voice that carried throughout the building, "this facility is hereby closed for violations of city building codes, health regulations, and zoning restrictions. All occupants must evacuate immediately." David appeared from the workshop floor, his hands still dirty from working on the water purification systems they had been installing. "What specific violations are you claiming?" he asked calmly, though Zara could see the tension in his shoulders. Thale smiled coldly and gestured to one of his assistants, who began reading from a tablet in a monotone voice. "Unauthorized construction modifications, failure to obtain proper permits for residential occupancy, inadequate fire safety systems, improper waste disposal protocols, violation of maximum occupancy limits, and operation of an unlicensed social services facility." As the list continued, Zara felt her stomach sink. She recognized this tactic from her time on the streets: overwhelm the target with so many technical violations that they couldn't possibly address them all, even if most of the charges were spurious or based on selective enforcement of rarely used regulations. "We can address any legitimate safety concerns," David said, his engineer's mind already working through the problems. "Give us a reasonable timeline to bring everything into compliance." "The violations are too extensive for remediation," Thale replied. "The building must be evacuated immediately. Occupants will be transported to appropriate municipal facilities." At those words, Zara saw panic spread across the faces of the shelter residents. They all knew what municipal facilities meant: overcrowded, dangerous places where people were warehoused rather than helped. Dren, the elderly man who had been one of their first residents, actually stepped backward toward the emergency exit. "You can't do this," Zara said, surprising herself with the strength in her own voice. "These people have done nothing wrong. They're just trying to survive." Inspector Thale turned his attention to her for the first time, his expression showing exactly what he thought of someone like her presuming to challenge his authority. "You are harboring illegal residents in an unlicensed facility. That makes you an accessory to multiple criminal violations." "What's really criminal?" David interjected, his diplomatic calm finally cracking. is a system that criminalizes poverty and homelessness instead of addressing the conditions that create them. The inspector's eyes narrowed. Your human perspectives on social organization are not relevant here. This planet has maintained order and prosperity for centuries using proven methods. We don't need outsiders disrupting our systems with their experimental ideologies. You mean you don't want anyone proving that your systems don't work? Zara said, her anger overwhelming her fear. You're afraid that if people see there's a better way, they'll start asking why their government isn't providing it. Before Thale could respond, one of his technical assistants approached with readings from their equipment. After a whispered conversation, the inspector's expression changed from smugness to confusion. These readings must be wrong, he said, grabbing the scanner and checking it himself. Run the tests again. While the officials huddled over their equipment, David quietly moved closer to Zara. They're testing for the violations they claim we're committing, he whispered. But we've been careful to meet or exceed all the actual safety standards. Whatever they're finding, it's not what they expected. The technical assistant ran the scans multiple times, checking different areas of the building. Each time her expression grew more puzzled. Finally, she approached Inspector Thale with obvious reluctance. Sir, the air quality readings are actually better than municipal standards. The water purification system exceeds city requirements. The structural integrity tests show the building is safer now than it was when we first cataloged it. And the waste management system is more efficient than most commercial facilities. Thale's face reddened with frustration. What about occupancy limits? Fire safety? The modifications have actually increased the safety rating, the assistant replied. The evacuation routes, fire suppression systems, and emergency equipment all exceed current codes. For a moment, there was silence in the room as Thale processed this information. Zara could see him calculating, trying to figure out how to proceed when his primary justifications had just evaporated. Then his expression hardened with a different kind of determination. Regardless of technical compliance, this facility represents a danger to public order. The concentration of undesirable elements in a residential neighborhood creates risks that cannot be measured by simple equipment tests. Undesirable elements? Dren stepped forward, his voice shaking with anger. I worked for 40 years maintaining the city's water treatment facilities. I only lost my home because I got sick and couldn't afford medical treatment. How exactly am I undesirable? Jorik joined him, leaning heavily on his walking support. I was injured keeping the power grid running during the storm season. The compensation barely covered my medical costs, and I lost my apartment when I couldn't work anymore. Since when is being hurt in the line of duty a crime? One by one, the other residents began sharing their stories. Each tale revealed the same pattern. People who had contributed to society until circumstances beyond their control left them vulnerable. The guards who had entered the building with confident authority began to look uncomfortable as they heard these accounts. Kess, the young woman who had been assaulted in other shelters, spoke last. Her voice was quiet, but her words carried clearly through the room. I came to this city to study at the university. I had a scholarship and everything. But when I reported my professor for assault, the administration decided it was easier to expel me than deal with the scandal. I've been living on the streets for 8 months because no one would rent to someone with no employment and no family references. The silence that followed was heavy with uncomfortable truths. Inspector Thale looked around the room, perhaps seeing the residents as individuals for the first time rather than abstract problems to be managed. But his moment of uncertainty didn't last long. Personal circumstances don't change the legal requirements, he said, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. This facility is still operating without proper authorization. David stepped forward, pulling out his communicator. Actually, we do have authorization. It just came through this morning. He activated a holographic display showing an official document with impressive seals and signatures. Provisional operating license for experimental social housing, issued under the Municipal Innovation Protocol. Valid for 1 year, with the possibility of extension based on performance metrics. Thale stared at the document in disbelief. That's impossible. I would have been notified of any applications for this district. The application was filed directly with the Planetary Development Authority, David explained. When local governments prove unable to address infrastructure and social welfare issues, higher authorities can intervene in the public interest. As if on cue, David's communicator chimed with an incoming message. The holographic display showed a new figure, a distinguished-looking Villani female wearing the insignia of a regional administrator. "Inspector Thile," the figure said, her voice carrying the unmistakable tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I am Administrator Vex from the Regional Social Welfare Oversight Committee. I trust you are treating our pilot program participants with appropriate courtesy." Thale's face had gone pale. Regional administrators had authority that superseded local officials, and crossing one was a career-ending mistake. "Administrator Vex, I was not informed that this facility had regional backing." "The oversight was intentional," Vex replied coolly. "We wanted to observe how local authorities would respond to innovative solutions to persistent social problems. Your performance has been noted in our evaluation." The administrator's gaze shifted to take in the shelter residents and the facility around them. "Mr. Chen's preliminary report suggests that this pilot program is exceeding all success metrics. We will be expanding similar programs to 3 additional cities based on these results." Zara felt a surge of pride and relief, but also confusion. She caught David's eye and raised her eyebrows in a silent question. He gave her a small smile and a barely perceptible nod. They would talk about this later. Inspector Thale gathered his dignity as best he could under the circumstances. "Of course, Administrator. We were simply conducting a routine safety inspection to ensure the facility met all applicable standards." "Excellent," Vex said. "Your inspection report confirming that the facility exceeds municipal safety requirements will be valuable documentation for the week." "Documentation for our expansion plans. Please have it submitted to my office by the end of the week." After the officials left, the shelter residents slowly returned to their morning routines, though the tension in the air remained thick. David and Zara stood together in the common room processing what had just happened. "How long have you been planning this?" Zara asked quietly. "Since the second week we were here," David admitted. "I could see that local opposition was going to be a problem, so I started building relationships with higher-level authorities, who might be more receptive to data-driven solutions." He showed her files on his tablet documenting months of correspondence with regional and planetary officials. "I've been sending them reports on everything we're accomplishing here, along with projections for how these approaches could be scaled up across multiple cities." Zara stared at the documentation, realizing that their small shelter project had been part of a much larger strategy from the beginning. "You never told me." "I didn't want to get your hopes up until I was sure it would work," David said. "And I wanted our work here to be genuine, not influenced by political considerations. Everything we've built, every innovation you've contributed, that all happened because you saw what people really needed, not because someone told us what to build." Looking around at the shelter that had become her life's work, Zara felt a mix of pride, excitement, and uncertainty. The immediate crisis was over, but she sensed that their real challenges were just beginning. "What happens now?" she asked. David smiled. "Now we prove that what we've started here can work anywhere. Are you ready to help change the galaxy?" 6 months later, Zara stood on the observation deck of a transport ship, watching 3 different worlds rotate slowly below her through the viewport. Each planet showed the distinctive lights of urban centers, and in each of those centers, new shelter facilities were being constructed using the principles she and David had developed. The transformation of her life still felt surreal. From sleeping in alleys to traveling between star systems as a recognized expert in social housing design, it was the kind of change that should have taken years, not months. But David had been right about one thing. When humans decided to solve a problem, they moved with a speed and determination that often surprised other species. The Kepler Prime facility should be operational within 3 weeks, Administrator Vex reported as she joined Zara at the viewport. The local government was initially resistant, but the preliminary results from our other sites convinced them to cooperate. Zara nodded, still studying the planet below. Kepler Prime was their 4th installation, and each one had taught them something new about adapting their approach to different cultures and environments. The basic principles remained the same: design spaces that prioritize dignity and individual choice, but the specific implementations varied dramatically. "What about the Rigel Station project?" Zara asked. Space stations presented unique challenges since every square meter had to be carefully planned and resources were strictly limited. "Construction begins next month," Vex replied. The station authority is particularly interested in your waste recycling innovations. When you're living in a closed system, nothing can be wasted. David appeared from the ship's communication center, carrying a tablet filled with reports from their various sites. His expression was thoughtful, and Zara had learned to recognize that look. He was processing data and forming new conclusions. I just finished reviewing the 6-month statistics, he said, joining them at the viewport. The results are even better than we projected. Recidivism rates are down 70% compared to traditional shelters. Employment rates among residents are up 80%. Medical costs have dropped by half due to improved living conditions and preventive care access. Zara felt a warm glow of satisfaction, but also a nagging sense of incompleteness. Those are wonderful numbers, she said, but we're still only helping a tiny fraction of the people who need it. That's about to change, Administrator Vex said with a smile. The Galactic Social Welfare Council has approved our proposal for system-wide implementation. Within 2 years, every member world will be required to adopt housing policies based on your model. The scope of what they had accomplished was staggering. What had started as a desperate attempt to help one homeless individual had grown into a movement that would affect billions of lives across dozens of star systems. But even as Zara celebrated this success, she found herself thinking about the deeper patterns they had uncovered. It's not just about housing, she said, echoing thoughts she had been developing for weeks. Every planet we visited has the same underlying problems. Systems that treat people as disposable when they become inconvenient or expensive to help. David nodded. I've been seeing similar patterns in my environmental work. Pollution, resource depletion, infrastructure failures, they all follow the same logic of externalizing costs onto the most vulnerable populations. Administrator Vex looked intrigued. What are you suggesting? Zara pulled up a holographic display showing data from all their projects. Look at the success factors that made our shelters work. Individual dignity, community support, meaningful work opportunities, access to resources, and systems that adapt to people's needs instead of forcing people to adapt to arbitrary requirements. She manipulated the display to show broader social and economic indicators. Those same principles could be applied to healthcare, education, employment, environmental protection, basically every area where current systems are failing people. You're talking about restructuring entire civilizations, Vex said slowly. I'm talking about making civilizations actually civilized, Zara replied. Most of our current systems were designed by people who never experienced the problems those systems were supposed to solve. They optimize for efficiency and control rather than human welfare. David activated his own display, showing environmental data from the worlds they had visited. Take pollution control, for example. Current regulations focus on managing acceptable levels of contamination rather than preventing contamination in the first place. But if you design systems from the perspective of the people who have to live with the consequences, you get completely different solutions. The ship's communication system chimed with an incoming priority message. Administrator Vex accepted the call, and a holographic figure materialized in front of them. A human male wearing the distinctive robes of a Galactic Council representative. Administrator Vex, Mr. Chen, Ms. Zara, the figure said formally. I am Council Representative Harrison. The Council has been following your work with great interest, and we have a proposal for you. Zara felt her heart rate accelerate. In the few months since their project had gained galactic attention, she had met officials from dozens of worlds, but this was her first contact with someone from the highest levels of interstellar government. The Council is establishing a new department focused on social systems reform, Representative Harrison continued. We want to offer you the opportunity to lead this initiative, with authority to implement comprehensive changes across all member worlds. The offer was breathtaking in its scope. They were being asked to do on a galactic scale what they had started in a single city, rebuild social systems from the ground up based on principles of dignity and practical effectiveness, rather than tradition and bureaucratic convenience. But as Zara considered the proposal, she found herself thinking about all the individuals she had met during their travels. The single mother on Vega 7 who was working 3 jobs but still couldn't afford adequate housing for her children. The elderly engineer on Alpha Centauri, whose medical treatments had bankrupted him despite a lifetime of contributing to society. the young artist on Proxima Colony, who had been denied educational opportunities because his species was considered unsuitable for creative fields. What kind of authority are we talking about? David asked, his engineer's mind focusing on practical implementation details. Full administrative power to redesign social welfare systems across all member worlds, Harrison replied. Budget allocation authority of approximately 50 trillion galactic credits. Staff assignments from every major government department. And most importantly, emergency override capabilities when local authorities attempt to obstruct necessary reforms. The numbers were staggering, but Zara found herself thinking about something else entirely. What about accountability? How do we make sure we don't just become another layer of bureaucracy, imposing solutions on people who had no voice in designing them? Representative Harrison looked surprised by the question. You would report directly to the council, with regular performance reviews based on measurable outcomes. That's not what I meant, Zara said firmly. How do we ensure that the people most affected by these systems have real input into how they're designed? How do we avoid becoming the same kind of detached officials who created the problems we're trying to solve? David smiled at her question, recognizing the fundamental insight that had driven their success from the beginning. She's asking how we maintain the principle that drove everything we've accomplished, that the best solutions come from understanding problems from the perspective of people who actually experience them. Administrator Vex looked thoughtful. That's an excellent point. Traditional government structures aren't designed for that kind of input. Zara activated her own display, showing organizational charts for the various projects they had completed. What if we built the new department differently? Instead of a traditional hierarchy, we create a network of local implementation teams, each led by people who have personal experience with the problems they're addressing. She highlighted specific examples from their work. In every successful project, the breakthrough innovations came from someone who had lived through the situation we were trying to improve. Dren's insights into accessibility needs, Kess's understanding of safety requirements, Jorik's knowledge of how injury and disability interact with employment systems. You're proposing to put former homeless individuals in charge of housing policy, Harrison said slowly. I'm proposing to put people who understand problems in charge of solving them, Zara corrected. Whether that's homelessness, environmental degradation, healthcare access, or educational opportunity. The people with the most relevant expertise are usually the ones who have been failed by current systems. The holographic figure was quiet for a long moment. This would be a radical departure from established governmental structures. Established governmental structures created the problems we're trying to solve, David pointed out. If we want different results, we need different approaches. Representative Harrison looked back and forth between them, clearly processing the implications of what they were proposing. Let me present your counter-proposal to the full council. But I should warn you, there will be significant resistance. 2 years later, Zara found herself standing in the same alley where David had first found her, but everything had changed. The broken concrete overhang had been replaced with a beautiful shelter made from local stone, designed using techniques she had perfected across dozens of worlds. The narrow alley had been transformed into a small garden plaza, where people could rest safely while they worked toward more permanent housing solutions. But the most significant change wasn't visible in the architecture, it was in the people. Where once there had been only desperate individuals hiding in shadows, there was now a thriving community of formerly homeless residents who had become advocates, counselors, and leaders in their own right. They called themselves the Network, and their influence was spreading across the galaxy, faster than any government initiative ever could. The council finally agreed to our terms, David said, joining Zara in the plaza with news from their latest negotiations. Full implementation authority, but with mandatory consultation requirements and community oversight boards for every project. Zara nodded, but her attention was focused on a group of young Villani who were working on a new housing unit nearby. She recognized the signs. They moved with the careful efficiency of people who had learned to survive on the streets. But they also carried themselves with the confidence that came from having meaningful work and secure homes. How many worlds now? She asked. 47 operational sites with 12 more under construction, David replied. But the really impressive number is the secondary sites, communities that are implementing our principles without waiting for official authorization. The network has grown beyond anything we could have planned. It was true. What had started as a formal project had evolved into something more like a movement. People who had been helped by their initial shelters were traveling to other worlds, sharing their experiences and helping local communities develop their own solutions. The rigid bureaucracy that usually characterized galactic governance was being bypassed by networks of individuals who simply started building better systems on their own. Zara? A familiar voice called her name, and she turned to see Kes approaching with a young human female she didn't recognize. Kes had become one of the most effective coordinators in the network, using her experience with multiple species and cultures to help establish programs on worlds where language and cultural barriers made official cooperation difficult. "This is Maya," Kes said, introducing her companion. "She just arrived from Earth with a proposal you need to hear." Maya stepped forward with the slightly overwhelmed expression that Zara remembered from her own early days of interstellar travel. "I represent a coalition of Earth organizations working on social justice issues. We've been following your work, and we think it's time to bring these principles home to where they started." Zara raised her eyebrows. "Earth wants to adopt alien-designed social welfare systems? Earth needs to learn from what humans have accomplished when they weren't constrained by Earth's existing power structures," Maya corrected gently. "The problems you've solved out here exist on Earth too, but our political systems make change almost impossible. Maybe external success will create pressure for internal reform." David looked intrigued by the possibility. "What kind of timeline are we talking about?" "Immediate," Maya said firmly. "We have funding secured and sites identified in 12 major cities. The only thing we're missing is expertise from people who have proven these approaches work in practice." It was an elegant irony. The knowledge that had started with human innovation but been refined through alien perspectives was now being offered back to humanity as a solution to problems they hadn't been able to solve on their own. "I'll need to consult with the network leadership," Zara said. "This isn't the kind of decision I can make alone anymore." That evening, they convened a virtual meeting that connected dozens of worlds and hundreds of participants. The technology that made such communication possible was the same that had allowed the network to grow so quickly. When people who had been marginalized suddenly had access to galactic communication systems, they used them to organize in ways that traditional authorities hadn't anticipated. Dren appeared in the holographic display from his new position, coordinating housing policy on Vega 7. Jorik joined from Alpha Centauri, where he was leading environmental restoration projects. Representatives from every major network site contributed their perspectives on the Earth proposal. "The question," said a Krellian female named Zan, who had become the network's primary theorist, "is whether we can maintain our principles while working within Earth's existing governmental structures." "The bigger question," Dren replied, "is whether we have an obligation to try. If we've learned ways to solve problems that affect billions of people, can we justify keeping those solutions limited to worlds that are easier to work with?" The debate continued for hours, touching on issues of cultural adaptation, resource allocation, and the risk of their movement being co-opted by the same forces that had created the problems they were trying to solve. But gradually a consensus emerged around a characteristically human approach. They would try multiple strategies simultaneously and see what worked best. "We'll support Earth pilots," Zara announced finally, "but with the same conditions we've established everywhere else. Community control, resident leadership, and the absolute right to modify or abandon approaches that aren't working for the people they're supposed to serve." Maya beamed. "I was hoping you'd say that. When can you start?" 3 months later, Zara stood in a converted warehouse in Detroit, watching former homeless residents install solar panels that would power their new community center. The building had been designed using the same principles they had refined across dozens of alien worlds, but adapted for human physiology and Earth's environmental conditions. The project had faced exactly the same obstacles they had encountered on alien worlds: bureaucratic resistance, concerns about property values, and skepticism from officials who believed that poverty was somehow the fault of poor people. But it had also benefited from the same factors that had made their other projects successful. The deep knowledge that came from lived experience and the determination of people who had been written off by society but refused to write themselves off. The city inspector signed off on everything this morning, David reported, joining her as they watched the solar installation. Turns out that when you actually meet safety standards instead of just claiming to meet them, even skeptical officials have trouble finding fault. Zara smiled, remembering similar conversations on dozens of different worlds. The specific details changed, but the underlying patterns remained consistent. When you designed systems around the needs of the people who would use them, rather than the convenience of the people who would administer them, you got better results for everyone involved. "What's next?" she asked. David pulled out his communicator, showing her messages from cities across Earth requesting similar programs. Apparently, word is spreading faster than anyone expected. We have formal requests from Los Angeles, London, São Paulo, Lagos, Mumbai, and about 20 other cities. And beyond Earth? The Andromedan colonies are requesting technical assistance. The Rigel Confederation wants us to evaluate their entire social welfare system. And there's a new species that just achieved interstellar travel. The cetaceans want to make sure they don't repeat the mistakes other civilizations have made. As Zara looked around the bustling community center, filled with people who had once been dismissed as hopeless cases, she reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. From sleeping in alleys to helping reshape galactic social policy, it was the kind of transformation that would have seemed impossible just a few years ago. But perhaps the most important change wasn't in her circumstances, but in her understanding of what the word impossible really meant. Every person working in this building had been told at some point that their situation was impossible to fix, that they were beyond help, that society had no place for people like them, and yet here they were. Not just surviving, but thriving. Not just solving their own problems, but helping others solve similar challenges across the galaxy. They had proven that the only thing that had ever been impossible was the assumption that some people were disposable. "You know," Zara said to David as they watched a group of children playing in the community garden that had once been a trash-filled lot, "I think I'm beginning to understand what makes humans special in the galaxy." "What's that?" "You actually believe that broken things can be fixed, that lost people can be found, and that there's no such thing as a problem so big that it can't be solved if enough people decide to work on it together." David smiled. "Is that really so unusual?" Zara looked around at all the evidence of transformation surrounding them, the rebuilt spaces, the thriving communities, the networks of support that spanned star systems. "In my experience, yes, it's extraordinary. Most species accept that some problems are just part of life. Humans seem to take every problem as a personal challenge to prove that a better world is possible." As the day ended and the community center filled with the sounds of families sharing evening meals, Zara realized that she had found